Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I discussed the factors that contributed to the existence of America's first political parties. For example, there's a very big disagreement between those who had a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution and those who had a loose constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. There's also those who favored Alexander Hamilton's economic program and those who were very much opposed to it. There are the working and middle class folks who want a much greater say in government at every level versus the traditional elites who very much wanted to maintain their stranglehold over influence in the government, especially at the federal level. There are sectional differences between the North versus the South versus the West, what they want the government and the economy to do, and therefore how they want to see things proceed. And then, toward the end of Washington's presidency, there's a big difference between those who are more sympathetic to Great Britain and those who are more sympathetic to France and want to see the country with a better relationship with one or the other of those countries. Generally, Americans tended to cluster together around certain positions on certain issues. For example, if you were someone who was a strict constructionist, you were very likely someone who was from the South or the West, someone who opposed Hamilton's economic program, and someone who was a lot more sympathetic to France than to Great Britain. I talked about how Jefferson and Madison on the one hand and Hamilton on the other hand became leaders of these nascent parties as they developed in Washington's first term and as they really solidly took shape over the course of Washington's second term. I also talked about how Washington tried and failed to prevent the splintering of American leaders into factions or parties, and how he walked away after his second term, leaving a very significant power vacuum to fill. That was all the last episode. In this episode, I'm going to discuss why the highly polarized political environment of the 1790s continued in that fashion. I'm going to talk about how the parties truly manifested. They were ideas, but then they became very sort of harsh realities by the election of 1796. And I'm going to discuss how John Adams became one of the de facto leaders of the Federalist Party, despite the fact that he wasn't a very partisan guy. He was certainly not what you would call one of the high Federalists, and was someone that constantly professed to be against the very idea of political parties. But before I get into all that, I'd like to ask you to please like and subscribe if you've not already done so. Looking at the analytics from the channel, I can see that there are a lot of you who are coming back, and I really appreciate that. I very much appreciate your time and attention, but I would appreciate it even more if you would go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It would really help out the channel. I hope you'll do that. You'll get alerts to all the stuff that I'm doing, and it would be great for me. Thank you very much. I appreciate it in advance. I'm going to, as I usually do, give you the resources that I used to put together this episode, and I'm going to pose a question for you to think about as I go through all of this information. So let me go ahead and get started with the resources. First of all, they haven't really changed a whole lot. It's pretty much the same stuff from the last few episodes. I am continuing to refer to The American Pageant, which is a widely used APUSH history textbook. I am also continuing to refer to Give Me Liberty, which is another highly used APUSH history textbook. I'm using the David McCullough biography of John Adams, as the episode content might suggest. I am referring to the Thomas Jefferson biography, The Art of Power, by John Meacham. And I'm going to continue to refer to Empire of Liberty, which is the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers the period 1789 to 1815. The question that I think it would be good for y'all to consider as I'm going through this information to help you get a better handle on what I'm discussing is as follows. How did the Federalists and Democratic-Republicans differ from modern political parties? Why was this a result of the way political figures behaved at the time? And how did all this contribute to John Adams' election as the man who would succeed George Washington? I'll say that one more time. How did the Federalists and Democratic-Republicans differ from modern political parties? Why was this a result of the way political figures behaved at the time? And how did all of this contribute to John Adams' election as the man who would succeed George Washington? So think about that as I'm going through this. I think it will help you to have a more sophisticated understanding of all the stuff that I'm going to cover. Without further ado, here we go. The parties, such as they were, in 1796 did not campaign or ask for political donations or even particularly like to describe themselves as parties. Most politicians and average Americans profess to despising political parties, certainly as they seem to function in Great Britain. The Democratic Republicans saw themselves as a necessary organization because they believed they were a bulwark against the monarchists who wanted to transplant the vestiges of European social classes and government into the United States. That is to say, they wanted to transplant what had existed in Europe for generations, many, many, many generations, to the United States. That's what the Democratic Republicans believed they were defending against. And those are institutions such as monarchy, kings, queens, that sort of thing, aristocracy, dukes and counts and viscounts and all that kind of shit. Also, other permanent, well-defined class divisions and self-dealing by government elites that a lot of Democratic Republicans believed just came along with that whole way of organizing a society. Democratic Republicans saw it as inevitable that there would be corruption, that those folks who were in charge of everything and whose authority was undisputed were going to help themselves out at the expense of the rest of the people in a country, if that is how the government of a country was to function. Jefferson saw examples of this everywhere he looked. I've already mentioned in the past, I think, and other people of the time thought, Washington in particular comes to mind as someone who tried to tell Jefferson this, that he was paranoid, that he was seeing monocrats, monarchists all over the place. But in particular, Jefferson pointed to Hamilton's Treasury Department as a place where there was nonstop corruption, there was self-dealing, people were making themselves rich with the inside knowledge that they have of government securities and that sort of thing, land deals, all that kind of stuff. Jefferson was convinced that not only was there self-dealing, but that Hamilton and those in Treasury and those who were associated with the executive department were using all of this information to get leverage over Congress as well, that they were bribing effectively Congress either with inside information or with just straight up money in various ways from the Treasury Department to vote the way that they wanted members of Congress to vote. Hamilton, in Jefferson's view, was constantly in the ears of many members of Congress, telling them, vote this way, don't vote that way, and I'll help you out. I'll reward you if you do what I want you to do. There's really no evidence of that, though, as I have also discussed in the past. Democratic Republicans were generally suspicious of the federal government because of its perceived threats to individual liberty and to states' powers, and they were afraid of the authority and evolution of a strong presidency into a monarchy or some other kind of autocrat that would eventually become very undemocratic and would rule on behalf of these elites at the expense of average people. That's something that Jefferson was always talking about. Every chance he had the opportunity, he would talk about how he was afraid of the United States becoming like Great Britain, effectively. Democratic Republicans perceived the battle against Britain, speaking of Britain, in the 1790s as ongoing. They thought the revolution was not finished yet, that there were still too many connections to Great Britain and there were too many people in the United States, especially elites, especially those within the Federalist Party, who wanted the United States to be Great Britain 2.0. And so, from the Democratic-Republican point of view, in the 1790s, they were still fighting the revolution. They, the Democratic-Republicans, also saw American trade through that lens of trying to separate the United States more permanently from Great Britain. They feared and resented Hamilton's plan and its dependence on trade with Great Britain, did the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans represented a constituency of Southern planter aristocrats and yeoman farmers in the West and the South who wanted free navigation of the Mississippi River and cheap land above all things. They were not nearly as interested as were the Federalists, as was Hamilton, in having this very close trade relationship with Great Britain. They did not necessarily see the future of the United States as commerce and trade the way that Alexander Hamilton and some of the Federalists did. They saw the future of the United States as a nation of farmers. That was something Jefferson also talked about quite a bit, as did Madison and some of the other leading Democratic Republicans. Madison, Jefferson, and other Democratic Republicans favored France and strongly supported the revolution, the French Revolution, and its Republican trajectory. They very much saw France's revolution as a continuation of America's revolution. The leading Democratic Republicans believed that free trade among republics was going to be the future and the key to international peace. They thought that if all of the world were to overnight convert to being republics, they would trade with each other without any kind of major disputes that would lead to warfare, and it would be a worldwide utopia. That's literally how they saw things. I think it's a little idealistic, and if you look at the world today, there's a lot of republics that don't necessarily get along real well just based on the fact that they are republics. So I think my skepticism is a little borne out by the way that the world has evolved. But that is what Jefferson and Madison and a lot of the Democratic Republicans believed, is that once every country in the world had converted to being a republic, it would be a much more just, much more peaceful world. And they were holding out hope that France's revolution would result in a long-term republic. The Federalists, on the other hand, believed they were fighting against the anarchy and excessive democracy of the 1780s in the United States. Remember, that's part of why the Constitutional Convention came together, a big part of why the Constitutional Convention came together. There was a feeling that democracy had run wild, had run amok, and things like Shays' Rebellion happened that freaked out a lot of the folks who wanted to see the Union survive and thought that the mob had taken over in too many places in the United States. So the Federalists look at what's going on in France and they're like, oh shit, we can't have that over here, and we need to nip it in the bud as much as we are able to do so. Certainly, the Federalists were opposed to the much, much more chaotic phases of the French Revolution starting in 1793 as the Great Terror took hold after King Louis and Marie Antoinette were both executed. The Federalists caricatured Jefferson and many Democratic Republicans as atheistic agents of democratic disorder that wanted to tear down the federal government and invalidate the Constitution. Both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans tended to caricature each other. They exaggerated the tendencies of both parties for political effect in a lot of cases, but also because they were genuinely freaked out about each other in this period. Federalists saw commerce and trade, and to a lesser extent, industry, as the future of the U.S. economy. They were concerned that relying too much on agriculture would leave America to lag behind and be permanently subservient to the more commercially evolved nations like Britain, France, and the Netherlands. They didn't want to be some hub of basic agricultural supply. They wanted to develop a more sophisticated, varied economy, the way that Britain and France and the Dutch had all done. Hamilton's plan sought to gain the favor of American merchants, bankers, and international investors because he saw their endorsement of the United States as crucial to maintaining the prosperity and consequently union of the states. He and other Federalists thought that eventually everyone in the country would benefit from the program he created, even if not everyone benefited economically from it right away. He thought that the investment that a stable economy would bring, that paying down the debt would bring, would eventually find its way to benefiting everyone as the economy improved, as jobs were created, as more kinds of economic activity were established in the United States. And the Federalists didn't always feel so anguished and anxious about the French Revolution. Initially, they supported it, but its growing violence and the mobocracy, quote unquote, that it created, along with the eventual war between Britain and France in 1793, France declared war on Britain shortly after Louis XVI was executed, that all threatened to disrupt Hamilton's program, because Hamilton's program relied pretty heavily on a good trading relationship with, in particular, Great Britain. And if Britain and France are at war with each other, and the disruption that created meant that it was more difficult to trade with Great Britain, that jeopardized Hamilton's whole program. And American trade generally was not in good shape because of all of this warfare between Britain and France, as we will get to in a little bit. Neither party, the Democratic Republicans nor the Federalists, accepted the legitimacy of the other. And both parties thought the other was trying to destroy the country. So it wasn't just, I disagree with these people over here. It was, that guy's a monarchist and he's trying to like destroy the republic and he's trying to make this into just another Great Britain. Or that guy over there, he just wants the mob to run everything. And he wants all the aristocrats, all the wealthy people, all the people who have financed this country and helped the economy grow and help make it an independent nation to be guillotined, just like you're doing in France. That was the level of the rhetoric that was involved. And it demonstrates the way in which political disagreements can become histrionic and exaggerated and melodramatic really quickly. And if it sounds familiar to you from what is going on today, if it seems as though people who disagree with each other on policy can't just leave it at that and have to villainize people on the other side in just about every way imaginable, it probably should sound familiar to you. And it demonstrates the utility of studying history, because nothing that is going on right now in the world is brand new. It's why I like history so much. Anyway, political struggles over policy often transformed into very personal seeming battles over the character and reputation of those running for office. Again, sound familiar? Candidates and their surrogates and supporters, like Philip Freneau, who's a guy that I've talked about before, a newspaper editor that Jefferson employed during Jefferson's time as Secretary of State in the Washington administration. He, Freneau, attacked opponents in newspapers, in pamphlets, and through rumor spreading about the corrupt or immoral behavior of those challenging his benefactor, and in the case of other newspaper editors, their benefactors. So it's this kind of like client-patron relationship that stretches back to Europe. And that client-patron relationship existed not just in terms of politicians who employed the lower sorts, the middling sorts. It didn't just extend between politicians employing people to spew their propaganda or attack their opponents for them. It was also between politicians and folks who wanted government jobs. Patronage in that form, politicians handing out government jobs to people, was a really common way for those seeking political office to reward those who helped them to get it. And it's something that persisted for a long time, really up until like the late 1800s in the United States. You had this client-patron thing going on where politicians would reward their supporters with jobs in the government. Eventually, some laws were passed against it for reasons I will get into whenever I get there. But that's how things worked at this time as well. Also, there are some political cross-currents going on here because, for example, in the Northeast, there were a lot of middle-class and working-class folks who had political beliefs that aligned more closely with Democratic-Republicans than with Federalists. But because these folks were dependent on people who were hardcore Federalists, merchants or bankers or businessmen of other kinds, they tended to vote with the Federalists, even though a lot of their political beliefs, the beliefs of these middle-class folks, were more aligned with Democratic Republicans. So that's something that made the political picture a little more complicated in the late early 1800s. In the 1790s, very few people were seen as appropriate candidates for office, and in part because of that, political participation was pretty minimal. Competition was minimal, and so a lot of folks didn't feel like they had a lot of great choices for who to vote for when it came election time. And sometimes you had turnout that was less than 5% for a lot of these, especially federal elections, where those voting, which is also a pretty small number. Remember, at this point, in a lot of states, it's just landed, those with property, white men who can vote. So you're talking about a small percentage of an already small percentage of people that are even eligible to vote deciding these elections. It's not very small d democratic in the way that we think of it now, where most people do have the right to vote. I talked about before that Washington's selection as president by the Electoral College was unanimous in both 1792 and 1788. So it wasn't a real competition in the true sense of the word competition, because nobody was really going to challenge Washington for the presidency. However, when he stepped away, that changed. Washington declared that he would retire in the late summer of 1796. He was on the fence about it. He was still being pushed by a lot of people to stay in office, but he had had an assful of the presidency, and he was ready to get the hell out of there. And that left many in national office wondering who might succeed him. The sort of obvious answer at that point was John Adams. Even though John Adams was not a big party guy, he'd been Washington's vice president for all 8 years of Washington's 2 terms. He was in pretty good standing with all the Federalists, and most people thought it would be either him or Thomas Jefferson, who, remember, had been Washington's Secretary of State, but who had walked away from the administration in 1793-4 and had since relocated back to Monticello in Virginia and had been kind of orchestrating things from a distance, but not really directly participating in a lot of national politics. The end of Washington's presidency, it's also worth mentioning, was marred by harsh criticism. The first really, truly harsh criticism that Washington had faced was over the Jay Treaty when it was signed and the details were released. Many throughout the country who supported the French Revolution and France in general opposed Britain and saw the Jay Treaty as just capitulation. That the United States had given Britain everything it wanted, that we had not gotten any kind of guarantees that our ships would not be messed with again, that Britain had not opened all of its colonies or even itself, the UK, to American trade, and those were just pathetic giveaways by a Washington administration that was clearly full of monarchists who just wanted to be Great Britain 2.0. Even Washington himself could not escape the charge of being a monarchist after the Jay Treaty came out and was signed and agreed to. But at the same time, growing radicalism of the French Revolution, and there is a clergy revolt in New England among people who had originally supported the French Revolution because of its Republican ideals, because of what it was seeming to do to upend the old order that many in America perceived as unfair to average folks. But there were clergy, specifically in New England, which is still very puritanical, very Protestant at this point, who are seeing the very, very, very anti-religious element of the French Revolution. That's something you can look up. There's a really hardcore religious backlash in the French Revolution that alienated a lot of people in France who originally supported the revolution as well. But that turned off a lot of the clergy in New England, and they still had a ton of influence in New England. And they came out now as very critical of the French Revolution. The prosperity that came with Hamilton's economic program also made it so that a lot of people who might have been a lot more upset about the Jay Treaty or about our neutrality proclamation of 1793 when it came to the French and British War, that prosperity made those folks who would have supported France more and been upset about a more close alignment with Britain kind of forget how upset they were that we weren't totally backing France instead of Britain. Also, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, also known as Pinckney's Treaty because Thomas Pinckney negotiated it, which gave the United States pretty much everything it wanted from Spain in regards to the territory around Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. That helped to assuage a lot of anxiety or anger at the Washington administration for its dealings with Britain, because that new territory opened up, and that was great news for a lot of folks who weren't very supportive of the whole Federalist program necessarily. As I have mentioned before, it was considered unseemly, uncouth, to actively campaign for office at this time. So leading contenders like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Pinckney, and Aaron Burr let supporters in various states campaign on their behalf. They just kind of sat back and didn't go out and shake hands and say, hey, vote for me. That's just not something that people did really until about 1840. And again, I'll get there when I get there. At this time, the states had very different methods for selecting electors to the Electoral College. It was not the case that everybody voted who could vote in a state, and the electors in those states then said, okay, John Adams got the majority of votes from voters in my state of, let's say, Pennsylvania, so I am an elector and I am going to vote for John Adams, and so are all the other electors in the state of Pennsylvania. That's not how it worked. Some states did work that way. I think it was a half dozen of them at this time out of the 16 that existed in the United States, but only 6 of the 16 decided the electors to the Electoral College by popular vote. The rest had different ways of doing it. There was no influence by the electorate at large in most of the states for how the Electoral College was going to be decided. Additionally, there were no presidential tickets the way that there are today. The way that it worked back then was whoever got the most Electoral College votes became president. Whoever got the second most became vice president. There was no Adams and Jefferson ticket. There was no Burr and Samuel Adams ticket. Didn't work that way. It took the 12th Amendment, which we'll get to pretty shortly because it happened in 1804, to change that. In previous episodes, I talked about the Constitution, how it was created, and the Constitutional Convention, and I mentioned specifically in one of the episodes the very tricky nature of figuring out what the president would be, and in particular, how the president would be chosen. At the convention, the Constitutional Convention, when this was all discussed and debated and agreed upon, it was sort of assumed that one candidate would rarely get a majority of Electoral College votes, and so most elections would go to the House, where the 5 candidates who got the most Electoral College votes would have the possibility of getting 1 vote from each state in the House. So that is to say that the delegation of members of the House of Representatives from each state would all vote together in 1 vote. So at this point, if the election had gone to the House of Representatives, there would be 16 total votes available, and whoever got most of those votes would end up being president. But in 1796, it actually did not work out that way. John Adams did end up with a majority of the 138 Electoral College votes. He got 71. Jefferson finished second with 68. Pinckney finished third with 59. And Aaron Burr finished fourth with 30. I think Samuel Adams got 11 as well. And so Adams was the new president, and Jefferson, who had gotten 68, just 3 fewer than Adams, became vice president, which was more than a little awkward, as I will get into, because Adams, while not a very partisan guy, as I've mentioned, was a Federalist and tended to very much more sympathize with Federalist ideals and principles than with Democratic-Republican principles. And Jefferson was like the Democratic-Republican. He was like the leader of that new party. So you had a president from one party, more or less, and a vice president who was from the other party, trying to work together. And some people speculated, they hoped, that this would actually mean an end, or at least a calming down of the partisan divisions between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. They thought, oh, well, these two guys, they're friendly, which they had been for many years. They'd served in the foreign ministry in the 1780s, helping the United States get established and build relationships with Britain and France and the Netherlands. They were friendly at that point. They were still pretty friendly when they got back. They'd kind of drifted from each other. There'd been some bad blood, but it seemed reasonable to expect that maybe they could work together. And maybe the two of them working together across the aisle, so to speak, would help to calm down these party differences. Didn't work out that way. Hamilton actually campaigned for Pinckney and not Adams, believe it or not. Mostly because Hamilton thought it would help, campaigning for Pinckney would help, to prevent Jefferson from becoming either president or vice president. Adams found out, though, and Adams, felt really disrespected. And that was the beginning of the end of any kind of decent relationship between John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. They became political mortal enemies for the rest of the time that both of them were involved in national politics, despite the fact that they were both from the same party. And it wasn't just this incident. There's more stuff that I'll get into probably in the next episode. But this was the beginning of Adams believing that Hamilton was just an intriguer, a conspiracist, a political animal entirely with no morals or decency or respect, despite, as Adams acknowledged, his many talents and his great intelligence, and Hamilton seeing Adams as not worthy of the office and someone with fundamental character flaws in Hamilton's telling of it that made him a poor selection for the presidency. So the second half of the 1790s would be arguably the most politically divisive period in U.S. history prior to the Civil War. Needless to say, the coming together of Adams and Jefferson didn't really occur, and these divisions that I have discussed between strict constructionists and loose constructionists, between those who favored Hamilton's program and those opposed to it, between those from the South and the West and those from the North, and especially between those who favored a good relationship with Great Britain and those who favored a good relationship with France, just got worse and worse as the 1790s went along, especially when it came to our very rocky relationship with France during the Adams administration, which I will get into in the next episode. Thank you as always for watching. Again, please like and subscribe if you've not already done so. I would certainly appreciate it. Spread the word if you think you know anybody that might be interested in the show. You can contact me directly at howthehelldowegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me and leave a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks very much. Take care, and I will see you all next time.